Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back to John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast. Today, we are reading issue number 116, and just a little catch-up on what happened in the last issue. We found out that John's girlfriend, Danny, had an abusive ex-boyfriend who was stalking her. And we started with John coming over to her house one day and seeing that she had a black eye because this ex-boyfriend had assaulted her as well. Now, Danny didn't want John to do anything rash, so John promised he wouldn't do anything, but actually in the background, he did do something. He went to talk to a voodoo priestess who did some of her magic on a photograph that John brought her of Danny and her ex-boyfriend. And what it did was it swapped the feelings that Danny was getting during her menstrual cycle and made the ex-boyfriend feel all of those things. And unfortunately for John and Danny's relationship, the magic worked better when she was angry. So John kind of, on purpose, during this time of the month, pissed her off a lot, made it seem like he wasn't listening to her, and just kind of being a bad boyfriend all around. And even though it was bad for their relationship, it was good for the magic because it did end up causing the boyfriend extreme discomfort and pain, and also his body started to change, like he started growing breasts. And at the very end, he had a bad dream where the voodoo priestess actually went into his mind and make him feel powerless against a dream version of Danny. And all of this together seemed to work. He called Danny in the middle of the night and told her to stop messing with him. So it all worked out in the end. Danny never figured out that John actually did something magically to assist with her ex-boyfriend's harassment, and the boyfriend got what was coming to him. And at the end of the issue, it seemed like Danny and John were in a better place. So first things first, with issue 116, we got the cover. We see some green ghostly apparitions in the background, and they look like they're screaming in pain. And we see two children, a boy and a girl, running towards us, and they're holding hands as the boy reaches out like he's asking us for help. And we see on the cover that this is written by Paul Jenkins with art by Sean Phillips. Then we turn to the first page and we see a cemetery that has a jogging path through it and a bunch of construction workers that are digging up some of these graves. We see there is a man jogging on the path and he's following a bunch of red arrows that are pointing a certain direction that he should run, I guess. And over these panels, the narration says, "Long lifeless souls are rising from a state that is not sleep. The dead are dragged from their release by thoughtless insult. They are barraged by the incessant grinding of brick dust. Worse, there is a ripple in the afterlife's current by which they have become unsettled. They will not find any delight in the artlessness of the living, nor pity those poor creatures who try to fend off a future of infirmity and decay, because someone has flagrantly violated the natural pattern of things. It is a criminal offense which must be drowned in the silent shrieks of protest." So as the jogger passes one of the signs with a big red arrow on it pointing the way he should run, we see a bunch of green specters coming out of the ground, and they're holding their head in their hands and screaming out like they're in pain, and this is seemingly due to the construction. Then we cut from the spirits screaming out in pain to a pub where Rich is screaming out, "Slob!" And then we cut to a shot of all of John's friends circling around one man. So we see Moppet, who's kind of like the gross biker looking guy with long hair. Then we see Straff, who's the really, really tall, big guy with glasses. Then we see the friend who's a guy I never know his name, but I looked it up for this issue and his name is Lofty. And they're all yelling "Slob!" as they raise pint glasses to the man in the center of their ring. And the man in the center we haven't seen before. He is a smallish white guy with dark black hair. He's wearing pretty simple clothes, just like a white undershirt with jeans and an untucked flannel long-sleeve shirt. And we can see in the background as his friends celebrate that John is just sitting at the bar and he's watching this. Then we cut to John at the bar and the bartender is covering his ears like they're being way too loud. And we even see Cider running around the room yelling, "Slob!" copying the older men. And as Cider rushes past him, John says, "Christ on a bike." And then he yells over to his friends, "Oi! Do us a bloody favor and keep it down, eh?" And then John's friends turn to him in response, and the new friend in the center raises a pint glass to John and says, "Ah, good, strong friend Johnny Carrot. Kiss me, you fool." And then John turns back around and doesn't take the bait, and he says, "Fuck it, I surrender." So he stops complaining about their rowdiness, but he just hangs out at the bar, and as he watches his friends be all crazy, the narration says, "There are those exquisite days that seem to drift by, like dandelions caught on a light summer breeze. Then there are the rest of them, the ones that drift by like dandelions superglued to the arse end of a bull elephant. Speaking of arse ends, my mates seem to be enjoying themselves tonight. Someone should, I suppose. You'd think they'd at least have the grace to be affected by their recent consumption of God's miraculous essence, wouldn't you?" And then John stops paying attention to the rowdy men, and he turns his attention to Michelle, Rich's wife, and Danny, and they're sitting at another table talking. And his narration continues saying, "Course, there's always poor old Michelle, ever the tragic ingenue. It's not easy coping with 3 kids of various smells, shapes, and sizes. Danny's offered to listen in for a bit, so that Michelle can bend someone else's ear for a change." Then we cut back to the men, and we see the biker friend Moppet is holding his fist out to this new friend who was in the center of the circle earlier, and he's saying, "I'm serious, mate. It's an old English tradition. Trust me." And this new friend looks kind of nervous and does not seem to trust Moppet. Then we cut to Danny and Michelle, and Danny is asking her, "Who is he then?" And Michelle answers, "Some bloody mate of Rich's. His real name's Slobodan. He's one of them Serbians, ain't he?" And then she turns to Danny, and her face looks kind of concerned, like maybe she's a little upset about this guy in some way. And she continues saying, "So Rich brings him home the other night, along with his family, right? I'm thinking they come for dinner, and Rich says they're staying for a few days. I swear I could bloody strangle him, Danny. He's so bloody thoughtless sometimes." So I go, "Where'd you pick this geezer up from?" And he says, but she's cut off as John grabs a chair and sits at the table and finishes her sentence saying, "Down the pub. I wouldn't worry about Slob Love. He's too odd to be dangerous to anyone but himself." And then all 3 of them stare at Slob in the center of the room, and Michelle says, "Yeah, well, I'm not worried. It's just, I don't know if I can trust him, you know? Rich reckons he's on the run from the army. Like, if he was in Bosnia, he could have been a war criminal or something. You never can tell, can you? I mean, what am I supposed to do with him?" Then we see Slobodan, or Slob, walk to the bar, and I assume he is doing what Moppet told him to do, because he holds his fist out just like Moppet did, and he says, "Hey, Barry Barman, feast fuck!" And the barman is not very happy about that, so he smacks the money out of Slob's hand, and he yells, "You, out!" And then John points to Slob as he answers Michelle's question about what she's supposed to do with him, and he says, "I'd start by keeping him away from Muppet." Then we turn the page and we cut back to the cemetery, and it's either later in the day or a different day, because it is pouring rain, it's all cloudy and dark, and we see the jogger from before is running again on the path. And as he does, the narration says, "It begins with a drip, drip, dripping, noise enough to wake the dead, if the dead could wake. And then it's a jarring of feet and a halted breath against the cold air, belying the struggle of a man going the wrong way regardless of the consequences." Then we get a panel of the graves as he runs by, and we see some green energy coming from them, and there's narration on this panel that is saying what the inhabitants of those graves are feeling. And it says, "Why do you call us back?" they scream. "What do you want with us? Why must you torture us so?" And as they scream this, specters actually begin to rise from the graves, and they begin pointing at the jogger, but he doesn't seem to notice any of them. I don't think he can see them at all, and he definitely can't hear them because he's running with a Walkman. Then we cut to an old woman who's sitting inside of her house that kind of abuts this cemetery, and she looks like she actually might hear some of the ruckus, because as she's drinking tea, she's looking over at the window very curiously, and the narration says, "Beyond the safe environs of the dead's enclosure, the sounds of unearthly anger infringes upon the living." Then we cut back to the jogger, but as he runs by her house, we see she is peeking out of the window, and there's a specter right in front of the jogger, but he doesn't see it at all. And the narration says, "Their angry protest takes focus. One of their number is chosen to accuse and to plead for a return to deserved rest. But as this specter tries to plead with the jogger just runs straight through it." And the narration continues saying, "But the runner cannot hear what is unsaid. He merely shudders against the passing breeze as he glides, oblivious, through the vehement soul." Then we turn the page and we cut to John's friend Weeble, who we've seen before. He is the psychic medium who can talk to the dead, and in the last time we saw him, he was helping John with the dead soldier who had hid the flat from the world and wouldn't let go from the memories of his first love. So we see Weeble in a dark room, and if you don't remember, he is a large, white, heavy-set man who has red hair and a flat top. And when he communes with the dead, he usually has like green smoke coming out of his mouth and nose, and his eyes are green and rolled back into his head. And at the moment, he is conjuring someone up because we see him with his hands on a guitar and the Sex Pistols record album, Nevermind the Bollocks. And he is communing right now at this moment because we hear a spirit say, "So we were touring in America, right? And some wanker from EMI decides they don't like the album." Then we hear Weeble say, "So what? Nobody liked it, Sid." So apparently, Weeble is talking to Sid Vicious right now. And I apologize if my English accent for Sid Vicious is not correct. I tried to find some videos of him talking, but I probably messed it up horribly. So in response to Weeble saying that nobody liked this album, Sid Vicious replies, "Stuff it, you fat piss." And then it's almost like someone interrupts the conversation because Sid yells out, "Oi, hang about." And then he goes silent. And then Weeble says, "Sid? What happened, Sid? Who's there?" And then a green energy explodes in the room around Weeble's head. And we hear the intruder ghost yell, "Leave us alone! Why insult and hurt us? Asleep no more! Keep away your dog! Wrong way! Constantine!" And then as quickly as it appeared, the uninvited spirit leaves. And then Weeble's eyes clear and he says, "Oh, bloody brilliant." Then we turn the page and we see all of John's friends moving Slob's stuff into a house. And on this page, there is a pulled out shot where we see this new house that Slob is moving into abuts a cemetery with a lot of walking paths around it. So over these panels of Slob moving in, we see John is actually sitting on the stoop smoking while everybody else is lifting his furniture into the house. And John's narration says, "Come the day of Slob's big move to Selhurst, my indolent alter ego shows up, ready for inaction, thus enabling me to sit my arse, marshal the troops, smoke heavily, and avoid any of the actual graft. In a surprise move, Slob's abandoned Muppet as his English teacher in favor of Rich, which might explain why he's developed a rather unusual turn of phrase." So we see Slob's neighbor come out, and she is an older woman, and she's kind of seeing what's going on. And as she does, Slob sees her, and he waves and says, "Hello and good welcome, old strumpet." And she looks taken aback by being called an old strumpet, and John's narration says, "It's a bit like a cabbage learning Morse code from a geranium, isn't it?" And then John says under his breath, "Move over, Henry Higgins." But then John's mind kind of wanders a bit and he starts thinking about what Michelle said about Slob, how she's not sure if she trusts him because there might be something there because he came from this war-torn area. So John thinks, "I've been trying not to care about how Slob found the money to afford this place. Some questions are better left unasked. Like, why on earth would someone choose to live here, for example?" Then we hear someone, I'm not sure who, but it's probably Rich, say, "Christ, it's the black hole of southern London." Then we cut to the backyard of this new house, where we see Cider playing with a little girl, and I believe this is supposed to be Slob's daughter. And they're playing soccer, and as Cider tries to block a goal, it goes through his legs and he yells, "No goal, no goal." But the girl's kind of laughing and cheering because she did score a goal. And then she points behind Cider where we can see the cemetery through the gate, and she asks, "Who's that?" And Cider turns around, and then they both approach the gates of the cemetery, and we can see green energy coming out of the tombstones, and it's not just energy, it's actually like faces and spectral beings, and the kids, of course, get all freaked out. Then we see one of these ghosts approach, and they're an older man, and the narration says, "You are disobedient and willful," he screams. "For children should be seen and not heard. Your elders and betters are to blame for this. Be silent." Then we cut to inside the house where Rich runs in the room and he yells to Slob, "Oi, Slob! Sorry, man, we have to go home." And John turns and asks, "What's up, mate?" And then Rich opens the window so they can see outside, and we see Michelle is patting the back of Cider and he is vomiting. And Rich says, "It's Cider. He's caught a sick bug or something." Then we turn the page and we cut to early morning and we see 3 different people and what they're doing, and they are all in proximity to the cemetery. So in the first 2 panels, we see a woman sitting in a bed, and she has really short hair like a buzz cut or a crew cut, and she is sitting in bed reading magazines, and over these panels the narration says, "Irene did it. On a total whim like. She just sent off for the goods. And not just out of idle curiosity either, but out of sheer bloody lust. Great stuff, too. Pretty boys and girls direct from Amsterdam, all willing and able and almost in the flesh. Makes her wonder how something can feel so right and so wrong at the same time. Then we see an older woman sitting in a chair staring at a picture, and I believe this is the neighbor who was watching Slob move in and who was called an old strumpet. And the narration says over these panels, "Over at number 30, Miss Walker's noticed the disturbing undercut of violence beyond the window. She trembles, imagining all sorts of skullduggery in the cemetery. If only Charlie were here to protect her, instead of outside in the early grave she drove him to." Then in the last panels on this page, we see the jogger, and he is just leaving the cemetery, I guess after running, and he's coming back to his house, which also abuts the cemetery, and the narration says, "Ken Riley's run into the dark, through a graveyard, but it's only when he gets back home that he confronts the source of his fear. He runs because he's getting fat and old, and his wife doesn't love him anymore, and she never did." Then we turn the page and we get another scene from someone who lives close to the cemetery, and we see a black woman smoking as she stares out the window, and we see a man laying in the bed asleep, and then she goes over to the bed and she begins to lay down as she stares at the man, and the narration says, "Jane's woken up for the third time tonight. 10 minutes later, the terrors have receded enough for her to swallow a quick cigarette. It's worse this time than ever before, but then again, it always seems that way. Sleep paralysis is a cold, impersonal demon, and all the more poignant and debilitating for the fact that you suffer alone. The terror can be enough to slam you back into a cold bedroom wall and be convinced that someone has been in your room. For Jane, that someone always turns out to be Roy. She's joked before that he could snore his way through an earthquake, but tonight, she hates him for not caring. She hates him for being incapable of understanding her depression. She hates him for being able to sleep, because he can't hear the vague echoes of ghosts in the background, and he can't see the deep, ephemeral blacks that are darker than the shadows. So as Jane lays down and closes her eyes, we see in her window that greenish energy that's been crackling in the cemetery. Then we turn the page and we cut to daytime, and we see all of John's friends are at Slob's house once again, and it looks like they're about to do a bunch of yard work because we're seeing a push mower, and Slob has a weed whacker, and the grass in the backyard looks very, very long. Of course, John is sitting on the sidelines just smoking, and Slob is actually on top of the roof of this shed where they keep all this equipment. And like I said, he's holding a weed whacker up there for some reason, and he looks over at John and he yells, "Perhaps you help us working today, Johnny Carrot." And John looks up at him as he lights his cigarette and says, "I am helping." Then we see Rich emerge from the shed with a hammer in his hand, and he turns and looks up at Slob on the roof and says, "So, how's the palace then, Slob? Settled in all right?" And Slob answers, "Ah, I slept in peace." And Rich is confused by this, and he says, "That's what toilets are for in this country, mate, so you don't have to spray the bleeding floor," because he thinks that Slob said he slipped in piss. But then Slob puts his hands together and rests his head on them like he's pretending to sleep, and he says, No, I slept in peace for all of night." Then John says, "It's peace, you silly sod." And then all of the friends kind of laugh at this, but all of a sudden, Slob gets very angry and he says, "This is not funny. You are always funny at Slobodon." And as he yells this, he has a chain hoist block in his hands. And it seems like this is really out of character because all of a sudden, everybody gets really quiet and they kind of look at each other like maybe they fucked up. And the narration says, "Actually, it's bloody hilarious. The problem is, the ensuing laughter is just a touch too raucous. It's our unwitting attempt to alter the course of today's prevailing mood. See, there's almost something definitely in the air. You can't help noticing that certain state of inevitable conflict about to make its first appearance of the week. So it's hardly a surprise when the United Nations peace talks are abruptly broken off." So we see a very angry Slobodon holding the chain hoist above his head like he's threatening to throw it. And then Rich gets mad because he got mad, and he throws the hammer on the ground and says, "Well, bollocks then! Do it yourself, you little Polish twat!" And at that, Slobodon throws the chain hoist down at them, and it barely misses Rich as he dodges it, and he falls to the ground yelling, "Ah, shit!" And it seems like that act of anger causes something, like we get a panel of glass breaking, which might be either because there are some panes of glass leaning against the fence that the chain hoist hits, or it's just a symbol of the energy that's been building and building finally coming to a head. And we get a panel of John staring towards the cemetery with eyes wide in shock, and it's just as Rich yells out shit, and John's narration says, which is an immensely appropriate reaction really, given the fact that the very same fecal substance suddenly hits the fan from every angle imaginable. Then we see what John is staring at in the cemetery, and all of the gravestones are crackling with green energy, and the spirits begin to come out of the ground, and they look very either anguished or angry. So as we turn the page, we cut into the cemetery where we're seeing more of the different types of ghosts and beings that are rising. So we see a bunch of soldiers in line, and the narration says over this panel, Decem et decorum est. The word comes down the line. Now is the time to advance, to smash the Hun or Johnny Jap, or whatever else flies in the face of what's right and proper. Then we see Ken the Jogger is finally getting attacked by the ghosts, and he notices them this time. Then we see the ghosts of children walking towards the houses on the edge of the cemetery, and the narration continues saying, Elsewhere, the frightened and forlorn strike out, commencing a primal infection of the living. Some of the dead are too bewildered to understand the painful truth of their situation. They believe they are free, even though they have nowhere to go. And so they wander aimlessly away, perhaps looking for someone to play with. Then we see Ken the Jogger's struggle end with him getting possessed by a ghost, and the narration continues saying, While some who have not yet died are suddenly enslaved by the sallow kiss of unsleep. Then we come back to Slobodon's backyard, where we see Rich and Slobodon are yelling at each other, and John is kind of sitting just watching this, and then someone yells behind John, Oi, Constantine! Then John turns to see Weeble standing at the gate, and he is frantic and yelling, Never can leave it alone, can you? What have you done, you stupid sod? And confused, John stands up and asks, What? I haven't bloody done anything, have I? And Weeble can see the argument between Rich and Slobodon, and he says to John, That's why your mates are about to throttle each other, is it? You lying bastard, Constantine. I know you're up to something. The souls are screaming it. And when he says this, he points to the graveyard behind him. Then we get some panels of the neighbors in the area and how they're being affected. And in the first panels, we see a couple doing heroin in their living room, and one of them is completely passed out, and the other looks very alarmed at this. And the narration says, Karen and Jesse had their evening planned, or at least each of them knew where the other was going to be, indoors, drooling and happy, and free from the cares of real life. Then we see some specters enter the room, and they begin to attack the person that is passed out from the heroin, and the narration continues saying, But so much for best laid plans of mice and men. It never ceases to amaze, does it? The sheer bloody bad timing of unwelcomed guests. Then we come back to Ken the Jogger, who is still in the cemetery, and when all this started, he got possessed by one of the ghosts, and now he is vomiting the specter up, and the narration says, Ken Riley's been across this way before. The spirit would know the sound of his feet anywhere. Thud, thud, thudding. And now, it's taking the opportunity to set him on the right path. Then we cut to the old woman neighbor again, and she is staring at the cemetery through her window, kind of worried, and the narration says, Someone's up to no good in the cemetery again. Probably the kids from the council flats. Old Miss Walker shudders, and wishes again that her Charlie were here. And as she stares at the window, we see behind her a ghost appears, and I believe this is supposed to be her Charlie, but he does not look happy with her or like he's trying to be nice and reunite with her. He has a pitchfork, and it looks like he's about to attack her. Then we cut to the neighbor Irene, who was sitting in her bed reading what I'm going to assume was child pornography, and we see those ghost children that were walking from the cemetery knock on her front door, and as she answers, the narration says, The children have found someone to play with. They've heard Irene from the outside. They know she needs them. Then we cut to the black woman Jane and her boyfriend Roy, and they're on the couch of the living room, and Roy is holding her in his arms as she leans into him, and Roy looks kind of worried, and the narration above them says, Jane had wanted Roy to understand, just to try even. And I think the reason why Roy is worried is not because of what's going on with his relationship, but because of a bunch of ghosts that are coming out of their TV and about to attack them. And the narration continues saying, It's why they say, be careful what you wish for. It could come back to haunt you. Then we see a bunch of the soldier ghosts running towards the backyard that John and everybody are in. And as John sees them, his narration says, "I can't even explain what's happening. I've cried wolf far too many times for that. Nevertheless, I make the obligatory protestation of my innocence." Then we see John yell to Weeble, "You're bloody kidding me!" And Weeble yells back, "Oh God, John, you... Oh!" And he's cut off as one of these soldier ghosts runs into him and actually possesses him, and he falls to the ground. And John's narration says, "Luckily, it's at this point that Weeble's train of thought is interrupted by a ruddy great stream of brown ectoplasm. So John is staring down at Weeble, who's on his hands and knees, and like I said, he's being possessed, and John says, "Christ, Weeble, I'm dead serious, what's going on?" And Weeble, who's struggling to maintain control, looks up at John and says, "Come on, Constantine, can't you see it?" And John answers, "Of course I can. I just can't explain it, mate. I swear, me being here is a complete coincidence." And a struggling Weeble replies, "Bollocks! There's no such thing as coincidence in your book." And John fires back, "Come on, Weeble, give us a break." But just then, a chair comes out of the top window of Slob's house, and John turns and yells, "Shit!" Then he takes off running into the house, and we see Straff is there, and he was already running down, and he sees John, and he says, John, it's upstairs." And as John runs past him, he says, "Cheers, Sherlock, mind out." Then John gets to the top of the stairs where there's a bunch of green light coming from one of the rooms, and we see Rich and Michelle crying, and Muppet is looking with terror through the door, and we see a teddy bear flying out, and John's narration says, "I can feel it as I take the stairs 2 at a time. God knows why or how, but there's a right royal haunting going down in South London. Maybe I'm the catalyst. I don't bloody know, but I do know who's responsible for the haunting." Then we turn the page, and we get a very horrific full-page splash of Slobodan holding a knife, looking wild-eyed and crazy as he holds onto the neck of his daughter, and he is very obviously possessed because we can see green energy crackling around him, and John's narration finishes, "It's the ghosts we carry with us." So John is definitely thinking that Slobodan has something to do with this because of whatever happened in his past with the war in Bosnia. But we will have to find out the history of all that in the next issue, so if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planes, trains, and comic books, all one word, @gmail.com, and we will see you on the next one.